Valentine's Day is just around the corner, so I thought we could talk about some of the unique words and phrases that are used in Appalachia to talk about love. So I made a list of the first words and phrases that come to mind. We'll get in further on some of them in just a minute, but first I'm just going to go over this list real quick. So in Appalachia, courting is dating. If you're courting somebody, it means you're dating. When I was young, probably really too young to actually date, but just people would ask me that in a teasing manner. There was a man, Jerry Shook, that was one of Pap's really good friends. He would always ask me, Tipper, are you courting yet? He was just teasing. He knew I wasn't old enough to court yet. But he'd ask me that, and his eyes would twinkle, and I would be embarrassed. My face would turn red because I was so young. But so courting means to date. Sparking, that's another one that means dating. If you're sparking with someone, that means you're dating them. That one's not, in my lifetime, I've heard courting way more than sparking, but that's still another one. If you're sweet on somebody, that just means you like them. I think that one's common way beyond Appalachia. I would say that's more of just an old way of saying it for lots of places. Sweet on means you like someone. Hein and shein, the first time I ever heard that one, Papa Tony says it. So hein and shein is kissing and hugging, but also means dating. They're hein and shein means they're going together, you know. If you slip off, it means you're going to elope. Granny and Pap slipped off. They slipped off and got married. A serenade or a chivalry, those are things like a noisy celebration that happens after someone gets married. Today's version of it, I guess, would be how people will decorate the car that the groom and the bride are going to leave in when they leave the church. Like when I got married, when me and the deer hunter got married, they tied cans to the car and used shaving cream and sprayed all over it. So that's probably the most common way today, but in days gone by, they would actually follow them. They'd wait till they went home, because in those days people wasn't going on honeymoons, you know, like people do today. So they'd wait till they kind of got settled back at home, and then all of a sudden a group of people would go in the dark and they'd start beating on pans and pots, and maybe they had some musical instruments, or they'd just yell and scream. And in some of the cases, they'd go in and get the groom and put him in a wheelbarrow or something and take him around the house and give him a ride. Anyway, it was all in fun, but those were most common in days gone by. But you'll still hear sometimes people talk about serenades or chivalries. And a serenade was also used at Christmas time, so that's another time that noisy celebration was used. I always like this one. It's just a saying, but courts like a stick of wood. So if someone courts like a stick of wood, you can imagine they're a pretty boring date. Jump the broom, that's a really common one, not just in Appalachia and other places. When people get married, they jump the broom. Took up, if you took up, those two, Bob and Sally took up with each other. It means they got married or they took up with each other and they're dating. Going steady, that's another old one that's common way beyond Appalachia. That's serious dating though. And struck on, if you're struck on somebody, that means you really like them. Going with, if you're going with somebody, means you're dating. Going with was real common when I was like in elementary school, and I remember one day, we were, like I said, we were way too young to be actually dating, but you know how it was at school. You'd say this is your boyfriend or this is your girlfriend, even though you really didn't go anywhere together or didn't do anything even at school. But one of my friends asked this other boy, said, would you want to go with me? And of course we were all like, oh my gosh, she asked him if he would go with her. But he didn't understand what it meant, so he just said, well, where are we going? So that was a good one. And then of course this one's really common too, but if you get hitched, that just means you get married. In Appalachia, it's really common when you talk about kissing. If you're talking about kissing, people call it sugar. I know that extends further than Appalachia into other areas, especially in the South. Michael Montgomery, who actually was the author of the first dictionary of Smoky Mountain English, he sent me this email one time, and he said, according to the Dictionary of American English, he was talking about a different one, sugar is widespread in the South. They define it as affection demonstrated through hugs and kisses. And so he was asking me if I was common with that in my life, and I was like, yes, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it, but we always use that. Of course, a lot of times, first thought it made me think of was when little grandkids are leaving, you might say, now give Pap and Granny some sugar before we go, you know, we've got to leave, give them some sugar. that usage more than the boyfriend and the girlfriend kind of thing. But it reminded me too of a story. I don't remember how old I would have been, pretty little though, but it just, as soon as I read Michael's email, and this has been, he's passed away, so this has been a few years back since he sent me that, but it just, how memories will just jump into your brain. As soon as he said it, I felt like I mean, as soon as I read it, he didn't say it, but as soon as I read it, it immediately made me think of a memory. Probably I might have been 5 or something, but the road that we live on, of course, comes up into Wilson Holler. When I was young, it was gravel. It was gravel all the way till Corey and Katie was probably maybe 5 or 6, something like that, 4 or 5, and then they paved it. But anyway, in those days it was gravel. Well, I remember my Papa Wade and Uncle Henry, they were, I don't remember who was coming which way, but in one of the curves, they hit each other. You know, it wasn't bad enough to hurt either one of them really bad, but they did run into each other. And then what I remember about it is that it busted Papa's lip. So what memory come back to me was right that day or that night after that accident had happened, and I guess that was big, you know, big news. Oh gosh, Papa and Uncle Henry have run into each other, and I don't remember how bad it damaged their vehicles or anything like that. But I remember being at Mama and Papa's, and I guess I was with Granny and Pap or whoever I was with. I guess that's who it would have been. And we were leaving, and they were like, okay, give Papa some sugar, but be careful because his lip was busted, you know, so I was barely kissing him on the cheek. But it was funny, I hadn't thought about that in ages and years, until Michael sent me that email. So it's funny what things jump in our minds sometimes when somebody tells us a story or asks us a question. So sugar, you'll have to tell me where you're from, if that's common to talk about kisses or hugs and kisses being called sugar. So here's some more information from the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English about a chivalry, or it was not the serenade, but both, they're kind of interchangeable, but this was specifically about a chivalry. So 1972, Cooper, North Carolina Mountain Folklore, said when a couple was married, within a few nights it was serenaded or given a chivalry. The leader, every neighborhood had one, summoned his followers to meet him on a given night. The serenade consisted of horns, the ringing of cowbells, beating of tin pans, until the couple opened the door and invited everyone to come inside. 1981, Whitener, Folkways. The chivalry, on the other hand, took place at night, and the indignities forced on the married couple were sometimes not only downright embarrassing, but a trifle rough. The chivalry setting was the cabin to be occupied by the newlyweds the first night, but even before the couple reached the cabin, some mischievous soul had attempted to sneak into the bedroom and cowbell the mattress. Then after the couple had been given time to retire for the night, the chivalry officially began. A crowd of friends and neighbors descended on the cabin, armed with dishpans, wash tubs, and other noise-making instruments. Individuals shouted crudities, kicked on doors, shone their lanterns through the windows, and otherwise attempted to force the couple to open the door for a continuation of post-wedding festivities. At the time, the groom might invite the group in for food and drink, singing and dancing. 1982, Powers and Hannah, Cataloochee. A bride and groom were apt to be greeted with a chivalry, which might include riding a groom on a rail in his nightclothes and dumping him in a cold creek. That sounds pretty cruel, doesn't it? 1991, Haynes, Haywood Home. After the guests were gone, everything would be quiet for a while. Then bedlam would break loose outside the house as the chivalry began. Wedding guests had returned with all kinds of noisemakers imaginable. The couple was being serenaded in a special serenading, and the racket went around and around the house. Then the men would go in and take the groom from his bed. The men would parade him on their shoulders around and around the house. If he was prepared, he had his clothes on. If not, they took him half-clothed. Around the house they'd go, laughing and joking at the groom's expense. Meanwhile, women would take gifts in the house and pile them on the bride's bed. After that, everyone went home for good and left the couple in peace. So here's another entry from the dictionary for spark. Remember a minute ago I said sparking equals dating, so this is spark. Spark is a verb, especially of a man, to woo, court, hence sparking equals courting. 1859, River, or Fisher's River. I sparked her a little that night and told her I was going with her to meet next Sunday. 1935, Shepherd, Cabins in Laurel. When he comes and takes her to the church house and calls on her with presents of candy and records, they have advanced to the sparking stage. 1936, sparking in Madison County and Swain County was documented. 1939, in the Hall collection, Cades Cove, Tennessee, we was small, both of us. They got to deviling us about sparking, you know, and Will says, now, boys, that's got to be cut out, deviling them children. They don't know what sparking is. Even 1963, Edwards, Gravel, there was some fascination about talking on the phone, and many a good spell of light sparking was done on that phone in my dad's store. 1963, Medford, Mountain People, while the women would never encroach on the men's side, young men, when sparking, would sometimes venture over to the women's side of the church or public meeting place. 1974, if I could just get to read that letter, why, I'd know how to start. We called it sparking then. 1993, Weaver, Scotch-Irish speech, also expressions such as sparking, meant dating, courting, dating with serious intent, and talking, contemplating marriage. Very distinct in meaning in West Virginia, were used interchangeably in the Carolinas. So that's neat in saying in West Virginia, if you were sparking, it just meant you were dating. If you were courting, you were dating, you know, with serious intent. And then if you were talking, it meant you were about to get married. Where in North Carolina, in the Carolinas, it says they were kind of interchangeable. Somebody might say you're sparking or you're talking or you're courting, and it kind of all meant the same thing. So that's interesting. The dictionary about, or the entry from the dictionary about while the women never would encroach on the men's side, young men, when sparking, would sometimes venture over to the women's side of church or public meeting place. That reminds me of a story. I was probably 13 or 14 years old. It's one of those things, there's so many things I wish I could ask Pap. You know, every day there's something I think of that I wish I could ask him. But this is one of those, and I didn't think of it again. Something jogged my memory and made me remember it one time when I was writing on the Blind Pig and the Acorn since Pat passed away, when I read that in the dictionary. But I was probably 13 or 14 years old, and our pastor at church was preaching a revival over in Suches, Georgia. It was way up in the mountains, Suches. And so a bunch of people from church were going to go and support him, you know. So I went with Pat, but we rode with other people, and it was like a whole little caravan of cars going all through the mountains over there to get to the church. Well, when we got there, I have no memory of what the name of the church was, but it was a little old church that hadn't ever been updated. It was really primitive, you know. And in the front of the church, I remember they had desks, like the wooden desk from schools, elementary schools, kind of like what I sat in at school when I was young. And I'm not sure if they had them there because that was like for overflow seating, or maybe that's where they had their Sunday school classes. If you just had a really small church, like even the church I grew up in, the first church that I went to, then they built a new church and it was a larger, nicer church. But that first church, it was like that. So it was just kind of one big room with kind of like a little room off to the side. But there still, if you divide it up into Sunday school rooms, then some classes just had to meet, like maybe you meet back here in the corner in these pews and you meet up front in these pews. So maybe that's what the church was doing. Anyway, there were some other young girls my age there that come from my home church, so of course we would do like we usually did, and we were scoping out all the young people our age and seeing, you know, if any of them would talk to us. Well, in churches in those days, just like in the entry here, men generally sat on one side of the church and women generally sat on the other side of the church. Maybe back in the back more couples would sit together, but mostly that was how it was. It's kind of like the men's side and the women's side. Well, Pap always sat with the men. That's how he did. You know, he always sat, even if we went to a different church, he would sit with the men, wherever the men were sitting. So anyway, me and my friend, we were sitting in the very back of the church. You know, we were being rebellious, I guess. That was a form of rebellion, wanting to sit on the back bench of the church. So that's where we were sitting. And we were, like I said, scoping out everybody. Well, it didn't take us long to notice in their choir, and their choir was really top-notch. It was great, beautiful singing. There was a young man about our age, maybe a little bit older than us, but he was really nice looking. And he had his hair was like flipped back, kind of like Johnny Cash would have wore his in the really early days of his career. Anyway, so we both really noticed him, you know, and was like, you know, elbowing each other. Well, the choir sung, and unbelievably, that young man come all the way back through the church and sat down right beside me. Well, I didn't even know what to say. Of course, I didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything either. But it was funny, and then they asked there to be an altar prayer. So there was, and everybody, the adults mostly, went to the altar to pray. Well, when they got through praying, Pap, instead of going back to sit with the men, he had noticed that that young man, I guess, is all I can think of, and like I said, I never asked him and had forgot about this memory, but he noticed that young man had come back there and sit with me. So instead of sitting with the men, he come all the way to the back of the church and sit on the other side of me. And I was just really like thinking, oh my goodness, I've never got in trouble in church. I wonder, and then I thought, well, I ain't got in trouble. I ain't done nothing. We ain't been here 20 minutes. What could it be? And then I thought, it has to be that boy's sitting beside me and that Pap, you know, maybe Pap didn't like how he looked or something. I don't know. So anyway, I thought, well, as soon as we leave, I'll ask Pap. I'll get him to tell me why he sat with me in church when he hadn't sat with me since I was a little girl, you know, little bitty kid. And then I was sitting with him. He wasn't sitting with me. But anyway, of course, it's the way the world goes. We got back in the car after the service was over. We were riding with other people, and then it was that long drive home. And then I just forgot about it, and I never asked him. And I even forgot about the memory until I read that in the dictionary. And then I thought, man, I wish I could go back and ask Pap what he thought, what he noticed about that young man that he didn't like, that he come and sat with me. Anyway, that's just a funny story. One term of endearment, like love, term of endearment that I found it years ago when I was reading in one of John Paris's articles, and I just fell in love with it. So it's Donny Gal. So a Donny Gal means sweetheart, an expression British sailors picked up in Spanish or Italian ports and preserved by backwoodsmen whose ancestors for 2 centuries never saw the tides. That was what John Paris said. If you think it's got a different meaning or if you've ever heard it before, please share it. So that was his definition of it, Donny Gal. But I've just loved it ever since then. I try to remember, and every once in a while I call Corey and Katie my Donny Gals. And in fact, when I first read it, it made me think of, when I read John Paris, it made me think of this one picture of Corey that I took, and I wasn't especially trying to take a picture of the back of her head, but that's what I did, and the sun was shining through her hair, and it was just the sweetest picture, and she has the sweetest disposition anyway, and it just immediately made me think of her. So I try to, that's one I wish would come back into fashion, Donny Gal. I just think it's the sweetest term of endearment. This was an interesting entry that I found in the dictionary. I've not really ever experienced it nor even really heard of it, but it's a round robin. So 1995, Adams come go home. Granny would call up and order me to her house to haul the backwoods singers to some backwoods community center or the basement in some little church so far off the road that you had to drive as far as you could, then get out and walk a mile. The gatherings were called round robins. The room would usually be empty except for a huge circle of chairs in the middle of the room. A little before 7 o'clock, every chair would be occupied by an ancient. Well, ancient to me then meant over 40 because he was young, male or female, and before long the room would swell with the sounds of the old love songs as one after the other of these singers took their turn. I attended many a round robin. I've never been to a round robin, but boy, that makes me want to go, don't it you? Another interesting one from the dictionary is the word scrooge. So let me read it to you, the scrooge part. So scrooge, scrooge down, scrooge up, or scrooge over. It's squeezed together in a small place, to move over, to make room for others, to crouch, to huddle. 1895, Edison and Fairchild, Tennessee mountains. Scrooge means to crowd. Oh, we scrooged 'em up. 1913, Capehart, our Southern Highlanders. Get up, pup, you've scrooched right here in front of the fire. 1926, Bird, Cullowhee word list. Scrooge means crowd. Too many boys tried to scrooge in on the bench. In 1936, it was scrooched down was documented in Madison County and Swain County, North Carolina. Let's see, 1979, Carpenter, Walton Moore. The youngins was all scrooched up in the bedstead. 1982, Smokey's Heritage, scrooch, to crouch down. If you were scrooching down, you'd crouch down. 1986, Ogle, Lucinda. So I scrooched around through the rhododendron thicket and went over the hilltop to fill my sacks full of the pretty lacy ground pine, thinking I would have 50 cents when the peddler took it to Knoxville. 1996, Montgomery collection, scrooch up like you got a family. He scrooched up like he was freezing to death. 1998, Brewer, don't scrooch, is another word that is dying away. It describes the midway point between being crowded and being squashed together. As youngsters, we were forever yelling, "Mom, she's scrooching me." if a sister got a little too close. Anyway, so those are interesting ones, which none of those especially talk about a scrooch being anything to do with love. But if you're thinking about somebody scrooching up close to you, then you can see how that sort of fits. And Del McCurry has a song, I can't think of the name of the song at the moment, but it says something in there's a line, it might be, it's Black Mountain something. It's the one about he's traveling back and forth to Black Mountain to see his sweetheart. But he says she sits all scrooched up to me and it's so nice. So that's one. And that's the most common usage here today in my family. We still use the word scrooch. So I'd like to tell the guy that thought that it was dying out, at least it's not totally died out. I hope it doesn't. But these are some examples that we would use it as. It's freezing outside. Scrooch up and get me warm. Chitter, scrooch over so I can sit on the swing too. If you'll scrooch those first two boxes together, I think that third one will fit. I've heard and read a lot about box dinners, but I've never been to one. So a box dinner was when a young lady would fix a meal in a box or maybe a basket, and they would take it to the event, and then the men or the young boys, I guess young adult boys, would bid on the box or the basket, and then the highest one would purchase it, and then they would get to eat dinner with the young lady, and then the money raised would be to benefit the church or the whatever other kind of charity organization, whatever was going on. But here's a really sweet quote from Carolyn Moss, Mountain Voices by Warren Moore. That's a great book, Mountain Voices by Warren Moore, if you can ever find it. So she says, my grandmother said that she remembered when she was 15 or 16 years old, maybe younger than that, 13 or 14, and they were having a picnic where all the girls made picnic baskets. They would take them up in the valley and have a big picnic and auction off the picnic baskets to raise money for the church. The boys tried to get their girlfriend's picnic basket. She had made a basket and they were sitting there, and all of a sudden these two men on these two big horses came riding up through the valley where they were. They were real tall looking gentlemen, a man and his son. The younger man was 17 or 18. He started trying to get her dinner, trying to pay for her dinner, but her father kept overbidding him because he didn't know who the man was. Her father overbid him and got the food so she couldn't eat with him. But he ended up being her husband later on. Ain't that a fun story? That one's fun. So I don't know for sure, but I've been told, I guess it was Granny that told me, or maybe one of my aunts, but that Mama and Papa Wilson, my Mama and Papa Wilson, that's how they met in a similar fashion, that Mama went to a box dinner instead of using a basket, which she may have used a basket, but they called it a box dinner. And she made the meal and Papa bid on hers, and then they ate together, and then they ended up getting married. Here's an interesting one I found in the dictionary. Dance in a hog trough. 1956 Hall Collection, Del Rio, Tennessee. 50 years ago, if a younger sister married first, folks would say the older sister had to dance in the hog trough. So there's 2 minutes between Corey and Katie is 2 minutes older than Corey. So I guess if Corey gets married first, Katie would have to dance in the hog trough. Knowing her, she probably enjoyed dancing in the hog trough though. I'm going to share a poem with you that I found. It's a really old poem, and it was a children's, kind of like a chant that they would say, like how we would do with balls, playing jacks, like with a little rubber ball and jacks. But they did this with either cherry pits or flower petals, grass seeds, probably rocks, any kind of little thing. It was a little poem that they used, and I really like it. I've never heard anybody do it or play the game or even say the poem. I just read it in a book. So 1 I love, 2 I love, 3 I love, I say, 4 I love with all my heart, and 5 I cast away. 6 he loves, 7 she loves, 8 they both love, 9 they come, and 10 they tarry, 11 they court, and 12 they marry. So that's just a neat little poem. I just thought it was really sweet. And so that was collected from North Carolina from Fawn Watson in 1922. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the words, phrases, and even folklore that surrounds love in Appalachia. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me any that I didn't mention that you're familiar with from Appalachia, or any of the ones that I did mention. If you're familiar with them or got a story about them that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. But mostly I just hope you'll drop back by often as I celebrate Appalachia.